Here is a red ink by Sailor Yodaki.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I don't really think it's pronounced Yodaki. I think it's pronounced Yodaki. And that's because they're obviously huge Star Wars fans. And yet I don't understand why it's a red ink with Yoda's name, because he had a green lightsaber and he never was with the dark side of the Force. It is a red, and for that, I'm going to remind you that red doesn't tend to be one of my favorite ink colors. This one does have some tone variation by pen, which doesn't happen to the reds that I tend to prefer, but that doesn't mean that it is a bad red. And generally it doesn't shade, which, you know, I'm going to call good, but I did notice a fair amount of shading on Clairfontaine paper. This may be a red, or sorry, this may not be a red for me, but I tend to prefer reds that are more the Bordeaux red. So I know I have that bias, but it is a really good red and performs really well on fountain pen paper, and even especially non-fountain pen papers, which is a good thing for those people that use that type of paper a lot.
The pen for today is
a Sailor 1911.
All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine, we have a nice bright bold red on the page, really drawing your attention to it. It has no feather in it, has no spread. It does have some shading interrupting the monotone red that could be there. Look at interrupted on the second line. It starts as a lighter tone and gets very dark at the TE, lightening up into the R's until it gets to the Portage at the end, where it gets much darker again. Shading for red inks is not very common, so when it does happen, it is kind of impressive. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading that will happen. Look at will on the second line, and you're going to see that it starts lighter on the WI, gets very dark on that first L and lightens up just a little bit on the last L, ending very well. Look at ended right underneath that, where it starts light and gradually shades to very dark at the end of the last D. Very nice. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, with no feathering, with no spread, with cracks of shading really coming through. You see it on crack in the first line, where it starts lighter, gets darker all the way to the K. It's like magic when you look at Gandalf on the first line. That starts very dark at the beginning of the G. The G also lightens up a bit. It stays lighter till the N that gets just a tad bit darker. The up and down stroke of the D, very dark. The O is light, and the LF is very dark again. Back to some shading. Look at back on the second line. Starting dark, getting light at the C, and very dark at the K. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, not as lively a tone. no feathering, no spread, almost nothing for shading. You only really see it on the D of "and" on the first line. Otherwise, we have a very consistent, solid performing red, which is how I prefer my reds to perform. And on this non-fountain pen friendly paper, it's doing a bang up job. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, with no feathering, tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering and with no spread, with no shading, giving those great solid red lines all the way through. And I think if you were using this, just looking at the two of them, I think they're both great. This paper, I think the extra fine's coming out a little bit nicer as it is, even though it was slightly lighter in tone. Looking at the stub nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the medium, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with only a couple of tiny spots of shading that are a little bit darker. So largely, I'm going to say this is not shading and still being a solid red performing ink, looking good on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ink did get a bit deeper into the page on the stub and the medium, but I wouldn't write on the back of the page. I don't think it's going to stop most people from writing on the back of the page. Go with the extra fine. It's going to be a bit better for that, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, but maintaining that lively tone. No feather, no spread, few moments of shading. Like when you look at moments on the second line, it starts out lighter than it was on that directly next to it. And the M is lighter, the O darkens just a hair, lightens at the M, a hair darker again at the E, lighten at the M, much darker at the T. The shading definitely appeared here, no problems. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Obviously a very opaque ink that it is not affected by this paper at all. With no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, giving good solid lines the whole way through. Really a very nice performance. And I definitely see this working super well on these non-fountain pen friendly papers. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread, and we get little bits of shaving. Shaving? Not shaving. I'm keeping the beard. Shading, perhaps. And on the first line, A is dark, the N lightens up a little bit, and the D gets very dark. But and directly underneath that starts light and works its way very dark at the D, waving some of that color around, looking at waving right next to that starts light, works its way very gradually to very dark at the G. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading, and it's almost laughable, if you will. Look at laugh on the second line. Starts darker on the LA and lightens up on the UG, but tiny bit darker on the H. Now, the shading that's occurring here is not as standout as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it's definitely there. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with very little shading, only a couple of spots, like the comma between men and on the first line, the question mark underneath that. Little bits like that, but not really very much. If you look at names right in the center on the second line, the ES is only slightly darker than the NAM. And I say only slightly, and I'm hoping it's going to fully come through on camera. The shading here is not as well as it really did, I think, on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. When it comes to shading, we're going to have to ask our good friends Balin and Dwalin on the second line. The B starts darker, lightens up through the hoops, but at the bottom of the B gets darker into the A, and during the A transitions to a lighter color till you get to the L that darkens up, and the I lightening up until you get to the end of the N. Now, and is a nice midtone at the A, light at the N and beginning of D, very dark at the end of the D, and Dwalin has to come in with his comments on this. The D is dark, the W lightens up to the second part of the W, darkens, lighter into the A, nice midtone on Lin at the end until the end of the N, where it gets much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we have no surprises that there's no bleeding, no ghosting, because it would really always be a surprise if it happened here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ancient Charm, the Phoenix.
Here is Diamine Poppy Red. Here is Monteverde Valentine Red. Here is Sailor Clown Teardrop Ruby. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, duller as a tone, not so lively on the page. We have no feathering, we have no spread, we have no shading, which for a student notebook like this and for its purposes here is perfectly good. But I do find this red to be a little paler than I would prefer for this application. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, and lighter than on the Clairfontaine, quite a bit lighter than the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get little bits of shading that can happen. On growled on the first line, it's a midtone on the GR, lighter on the W, dark on the lead at the end, where crack on the third line is a midtone C, lightening on the rack in the center, where the K at the end is very dark, but the shading that's happening here isn't huge. So the subtle amount for the student notebook, I think, is really good. The slightly darker tone, I definitely appreciate more than what I had with the extra fine. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering and no spread. This paper really tends to do well with fountain pen inks, and this ink that does well with non-fountain pen friendly papers, what a great combination together. No feather, no spread, little moments of shading like Hall on the first line, starts darker on the H, lightens at the A, the first L, it starts darkening, very dark at the second L. I think it's really going to draw a little bit of contrast and attention to additional things you may add into your notes later. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making this great for students to be able to use so they can use both sides of the page.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Sheaffer Blue Black. Here is a gray ink by J.R.R. Stormy Gray. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis Indian Blue Bronze. Here is a black ink by Cross Black. The last writing sample. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis Indian Blue Bronze.
Darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feather and there is spread. There is no shading. It is acceptable for what we're seeing here. I don't think the feather and the spread are a huge deal. It does take it up to about a medium. The feathering's not distracting in itself, other than that it's there if you're a picky person about that stuff like I am. But I do see this as being a good ink with this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread. Both the feathering and the spread are a bit more pronounced than they were with the extra fine. Looking at Herd, there's a whole lot of feathering on the HE. On the D, oh my goodness, the feathers are just all over the place. 8 called, oh my God, it's all feathered. Oh God, this is... Oh my God, it's like there's a mess. It's like, oh God. No, it's not really that bad. It's just not what I would prefer. Do I think you could use this here? Yes. I think you need to make sure that you write large, write fast, and you'll cut down, hopefully, on some of those problems. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering and there is spread, and none of that is a surprise. There is a little bit of shading that goes on. You see it in boxes at the X's, a little bit darker. There on the second line, the H is a little bit darker where the T crosses. Now, when it comes to looking at this, I, again, don't think this is horrible considering that it is fountain pen, that it's fountain pen on 20-pound copy paper. So when it spreads together in some of the letters, that's why, again, write larger, write faster, and I think you can compensate and have something that's not horrible. Once again, really speaking to how well this ink did on non-fountain pen papers and crappy papers. It didn't bleed through. It didn't touch the page underneath. It is very deep into the paper. You can't write on both sides, but it's 20-pound toilet paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is the lightest tone, but doesn't even give that kind of pinkish look that some reds sometimes do when it goes down a bit less on the paper. So it held its own at being a red. The medium is only a tad bit darker than the extra fine was, but on fountain pen paper, on premium papers, it really showed shading much better than the extra fine did. The stub gave the darkest tone and gave the most shading. When it shades, it does look really good. I like the darker tone and the shading from the stub. So that is what I would really want to go for, is that darker tone. And I think that's likely to come from a wet pen, regardless of your nib size. So really, it's not about the nib size here. It's about the flow of the pen. I think you need a wetter pen.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.